We'll be starting in 5 minutes. We'll give you a 5-minute warning. So good morning. We're going to get started. Just before I get started, just some housekeeping. If you have a cell phone, can you please either turn it off or put it on vibrate? We appreciate it. Good morning and welcome to the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. Today is a special day. We have one distinguished, and I would say the final panel. I'll be careful in saying we save the best for last because all of our panels were outstanding. But in many ways, we save the best for last. And I'll leave it to the co-chairs to explain the purpose of this panel, what their thought process was, and why we're closing out the public listening sessions in this way, but it's an outstanding way to close out. As you know, on December 1st, 2014, President Obama announced his intent to create a President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing to deal with what was really simmering at the time, the issue of trust between police and many of our communities. And he made it very clear, not all of our communities, but many of our communities. And he put together a task force that's going to be led by two distinguished co-chairs, Professor Laurie Robinson to my immediate left of George Mason University, who's also the former Assistant Attorney General for Office of Justice Programs, and to her left, Philadelphia Police Commissioner Charles Ramsey, who's not only the Philadelphia Police Commissioner, but also the former police chief here in Washington, D.C. And then the 9 distinguished members you see that joined them. He put this task force together and asked them to come up with concrete recommendations on how to build trust, but do so in a manner that ensures that we are still enjoying and achieving the kind of crime reductions that we've had over the last 20 or 30 years. And we've put this, and the task force is responsible for providing the President a report on March 2nd, which will be next week, next Monday. And so we had a total of 90 days to put this together. In doing so, we've had a series of public listening sessions. Each one of them has been outstanding. There have been 6. Today's the 7th. That means we've heard over 150 witnesses. We've received even more written testimonies. And at today's morning panel, we will then be able to work together, deliberate, and then come up with the recommendations this task force will on what to give to the President. And so today is the last public listening session as far as panel discussions, and so there's no better way to end it. At this point, I would then like now turn it over to, let me say this, I'm sorry, before I continue. In the back of the room is a lot of staff from the COPS office. And the co-chairs have been very gracious in thanking them each and every session. As we close out the public listening sessions, I want those watching to really know what that means when we talk about the COPS office supporting it. So when the President created this task force, he then identified the Department of Justice to support their efforts to make sure that the task force has what it needs to do its job. My office, the Office of Community Oriented Policing Services, was tasked with providing those services, and I would say tasked and honored to provide that services to support such a great team. And the COP staff working with SAI has done just a tremendous job. If you think about what has been accomplished thus far in 90 days or less than 90 days, it's been truly amazing. So I want to tell them publicly from bottom of my heart, thank you for your leadership, thank you for your commitment, thank you for your dedication, and thank you actually for the work that is yet to come, because we still have to crunch a report out next week. But thank you for that. With that, I do want to turn over to the co-chairs so they can lead this final panel and lead us into the conclusion of this process. And I'll start with the co-chair, Commissioner Charles Ramsey.
Thank you, Ron, and thank all of you for being here this morning. This has been a very fast process that we have embarked upon over the last 90 days. It seems more like a week or two, actually, when you think back on just how compressed it's been, but a lot of good work has come from it. I want to thank all of you, of course, for your testimony today, but for all those that have testified before you, submitted written comments, participated in the audience. It's really been very helpful in us framing what will be the final recommendations that we will present to the President next week. I'm not going to go over anything in terms of how this came about. Ron did a very good job of that. Soon you'll be introduced to the other task force members. As was already mentioned, Chuck Ramsey. I have the honor of being a co-chair along with Laurie Robinson, who we've, I think, made a pretty good team here over the past few months. I am currently the police chief in Philadelphia. 7 years I have served in that capacity. Prior to that, I was police chief here in Washington for almost 9, and began my policing career in Chicago. I'm a native Chicagoan. and I started as an 18-year-old police cadet in 1968. So I've been around for a while and seen a lot of changes in policing over the years. Very dynamic profession, and this is just a period of time, again, when we've got challenges to meet. We will meet those challenges, and as we talk about and have we discussed things that would really assist us in better serving the public today, we wanted to put together a panel to lean forward and look at tomorrow and what lies ahead. And that's why you all are here today. So again, thank you very much. And I will now turn it over to Laurie Robinson.
Thanks so much, Chuck. It has been such a pleasure working on this super speed panel task force, particularly with my co-chair, Chuck Ramsey. I've been in this field for more than 30 years, working with the American Bar Association, about 10 years with the Department of Justice, and more recently in academia. And as Chuck said, our time on this task force has been compressed, but really remarkable, with the opportunity to hear from so many witnesses bringing such expertise before us. But our intent with this panel, as he said, was to look ahead. And I would characterize it that we do have a superstar group here, and that was our intent. So I'm looking forward in a minute to introducing our panel. But before that, I want to give our task force members, who, by the way, have been wonderful to work with, and what an opportunity to get the chance in what I would describe as kind of a bunker mentality as we've moved ahead. And it is something that I will think about for really the rest of my career, this opportunity to work with them. I'm going to start down at the end with Roberto Villaseñor, and then we'll move down the line. Roberto?
Good morning. As Laurie said, my name is Roberto Villaseñor. I am the Chief of Police for the city of Tucson, Arizona. I grew up in that department. I've been with them 35 years. I've been the chief for the past 6 years. This has been the culmination experience for my career, and having the opportunity to provide input and to receive input at this level and from such distinguished members as yourselves, and then also working with this group here. It's like instead of attending 150 different schools, I was able to bring 150 professors to me and just sit there and be awed by the information that they gave, and to try and pick the little pieces here and there that I think would go toward providing a framework of best practices. So it's been a wonderful experience, and I'm excited to get to today's work of deliberation. Although it will probably be long, I'm sure that we can come to consensus on a lot of the topics. So thank you.
Good morning. My name is Bryan Stevenson. I'm the director of the Equal Justice Initiative. I'm an attorney and have spent most of my career providing legal services to poor people, people convicted of crimes, people imprisoned, people facing conviction and sentence. I also want to just express my gratitude to our co-chairs for the remarkable leadership that they've provided through this process, to the COP staff who have organized these convenings, and to my colleagues on the task force. This has been a remarkably intense but really incredibly insightful and educative process, and we really appreciate those of you who are here today to help us complete this process. I am looking forward to working with the task force members and the administration, and hopefully doing what we can to add to the quality of policing in this country, and perhaps encouraging the debates and the dialogues that are necessary to make policing what we hope it should and can be. Just want to thank all of those who have organized this, and express my gratitude to you this morning for being here.
Good morning. I'm Sean Smoot. I'm the Director and Chief Counsel for the Police Benevolent Protective Association of Illinois and the Treasurer of the National Association of Police Organizations. Over the last 20 years, I've dedicated my professional life to advocating on behalf of rank-and-file police officers in various forums, including before legislative bodies, at court, and at the bargaining table. I'm especially excited about the panel today because I came up and as a student of criminal justice at the time that community policing was really starting to filter out into the country. And starting my career working with law enforcement as a practitioner and then later on as an advocate, I've had the opportunity to see the ebbs and the flows of community policing in departments of all various sizes, as large as Chicago and as small as a place like Granite City, Illinois, and on a national level. So I'm really excited and encouraged, and I have to say I'd like to express my gratitude to President Obama for impaneling this task force. I think it was a very courageous thing to do. I think it certainly was the right thing to do, and he put together a tremendous team. I'm honored to serve with the rest of my colleagues here on the task force, and look forward to closing out our listening session today with a look towards the future. And my look is quite hopeful. So thank you.
Good morning. I'm Sue Rahr. Started my career in law enforcement 35 years ago as a deputy sheriff working patrol, and it was somewhat on a lark. And 35 years has flown by. My last 7 years of my career, I was the elected sheriff in King County, which is the metropolitan area around Seattle. And I never in my wildest dreams thought I would have an opportunity like this. I think anybody being able to be part of this panel would say, this is amazing. We've got the greatest minds in this profession coming together. So anybody that says federal government works slow, not in this panel, not in this task force. It's been quite a miracle, and just such a privilege to be part of this movement. And like Sean, I'm very, very optimistic about the future. We really are at a crossroads, and we've got good people, goodwill, and a lot of great ideas. So I'm looking forward to putting it together. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tracey Meares. I have been for the last 20 or so years a legal academic, first at the University of Chicago Law School and now at Yale. My research has focused on criminal law policy and criminal procedure and trying to understand the dynamics of violent crime in urban neighborhoods and how to address it. More recently, I've been focusing a great deal of my attention on issues of procedural justice and legitimacy in policing. And so this work that we've been doing over the last 6 weeks has been extremely gratifying professionally for me. But it's also, like my co-panelists have said, an amazing opportunity not only to hear from experts like you, but to hear the voices from the community, from people who have, lost their children and who struggle every day trying to deal with both issues of crime in their communities and how to best come up with a strategy to have policing and law enforcement be accountable to them. So I'm extremely glad that we're ending with a panel on policing for the future because, and it's my hope that our report will be a launching pad for change.
Good morning. My name is Brittany Packnett, and 200 days ago today, you never would have convinced me that I would have spent the last 6 months standing on streets very close to my childhood home, standing up for justice, standing up for some of the 20,000 young people that I serve in my full-time job as Executive Director of Teach for America in St. Louis, and standing up for young men and young women who look like my brother and myself, and trying to create change from tragedy. And so this is not the only work that is going on in that realm, but I am deeply thankful to be a part of this step. I never knew that as an educator, I would know this much about policing. And I am thankful to have had the opportunity to help be a voice for young people in this process. And so I am hopeful, but I'm feeling incredibly urgent about the work that is ahead. And I thank you all for joining us.
Good morning. My name is Jose Lopez. I am the lead organizer at Make the Road New York. We're an organization based in New York City and New York State that combines social services and community organizing to work with our 16,000 members to advance mostly public policy around different issues at both the city, state, also at the national level. I am, as an organization, we're also a member of CPR, Communities United for Police Reform, an unprecedented campaign in New York City that started initially to challenge the NYPD's Stop, Question, and Frisk program. And the Youth Power Project at Make the Road is currently in the final stages also of our partnership with the Public Science Project at the CUNY Graduate Center, where we're working with about a dozen youth researchers to study the impacts of the Stop, Question, and Frisk program on young people between the ages of 14 and 24. So thank you all for being here.
Good morning and welcome. I'm Cedric Alexander. I'm currently the Public Safety Director in DeKalb County, Georgia, and also serve as the National President of NOBLE, National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. My career started actually in 1977 in Florida, Tallahassee, Orlando, and subsequently in Dade County, where I left, I think, about 1992, decided to go back to school and become a clinical psychologist, and I'm still trying to determine whether that was a good idea or not. But nevertheless, that training certainly has helped me a great deal in moving through this profession and helping this profession change as well, too. But with that being said, I think over the last 35 years, and I remember back in 1980, and many of you may remember the McDiffie riots during that time, and those riots actually grew out of a whole lot of years of distrust and quite frankly, police brutality that had been occurring throughout that community for a long period of time. And the reaction of that community after the loss of a life in the hands of police officers really changed the course of that community and changed the course of that police department as well, too. And being an alumnus of Miami-Dade Police Department, that agency, that community have really done a tremendous job over the last 30-some years in order to change the trajectory and the relationships that still exist to this day in that community. So there is plenty of opportunity here, I think, for us to continue to progress the field, as I often hear Ron Davis say, and who has been brilliant at leading us through this as well, too. So I'd like to say thank you and look forward to dialoguing with you this morning.
Thank you, Dr. Alexander. And let me turn back now to Ron Davis for some announcements.
So once again, for those who are watching, thank you for your patience as we go through this process. Put out a lot of thanks. And I just skipped two, and I have to apologize, so please give me a moment to recognize them. As part of this process, we also brought on board, besides the outstanding COP staff, the SAI team, we have two great technical advisors who are sitting at the table, Daryl Stevens and Steve Rickman, who are kind of behind the scenes, but they've been an invaluable assistance to the COPS team, to the task force. So thank you guys for your participation and leadership. I also want to remind people before we get to the first panel that this is being live streamed webcast, that we are encouraging comments from the community at large. You can provide comments by going to the COPS website. There is an icon that you can click on that says President's Task Force, and you can leave comments for the task force, recommendations, and it's a good venue. And we do receive them. You can also shoot us comments through Twitter at Police Task Force. And so please take advantage of those venues to do so. And with that, Madam Co-Chair, I think we're prepared to start.
Excellent. Now, in introducing the panel, in order to leave time for the testimony and questions, I'm just going to make very brief introductions. The full bios for these witnesses are on the COPS website. If I were going to go into the full bios, we would take up the entire hour and a half. These are very distinguished and accomplished individuals, and unfortunately, we don't have time to go into their full backgrounds. We're going to start out with Dr. Phillip Goff. He's a professor at UCLA. Welcome, and look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. Thank you also to the task force for all of your work, all those working behind the scenes. It's my honor to be here today, and particularly on this panel of distinguished individuals. 5 minutes. For the past decade, my work as a researcher and as president of the Center for Policing Equity has sought to bridge gaps between social science laboratories and the laboratories for democracy that American citizens and law enforcement negotiate daily. Today, I want to talk with you about the need for a stronger evidence base in policing and for further incorporation of social science in using that base to ensure fairness in criminal justice, particularly in the area of race. What I want to suggest is that social science can set the table for traditionally adversarial forces to come together and move towards the future. So as a scientist, both in my full-time job and in my spare time, it bothers me no end when there's an important question that lacks a satisfactory answer. And I have never been more bothered by that tendency than I was late one night, September 2008. I was writing a piece on racial disparities in law enforcement. And as the son of a reference librarian, I'm fairly good at finding things. At least I thought I was. I began about 10 o'clock at night one night, and then 13 and a half hours later, I had to take a break to go to lunch. And not only had I not found anything, and the research staff that had a full-time job trying to help me find things, I called my mom, and she couldn't find anything. And as the task force understands, the people in this room understand, that's because there are no national data on police use of force. There are no national data on police stops. There's no national data on police behavior in general. And what arrested me, what stopped me in that moment, was not just the embarrassing lack of data on something so fundamental as what police officers do and how that might affect the community, but that the data were a part of human behavior, something that we as social scientists know more about than anything else in the policy domain. So what I want to talk to you today is about at least 3 things that we would be considering differently if we took the social science insights seriously. First, social science has revealed for quite some time that we engage with others to the degree that they make us feel about ourselves much more than the degree we feel about them. So in close relationships, you're much more likely to make a commitment to a partner because they make you feel good about you than because you're particularly attracted to them. In race and social justice context, the work of Jennifer Richardson, Nicole Shelton, Jackie Verauer, myself, shows that concerns with how you might appear in an interracial interaction are frequently more important than any level of prejudice. And what that means, if we were to take it seriously in the domain of policing, is that we wouldn't just put an emphasis on procedural justice in how we treat the community, but the perception, the experience of procedural justice for law enforcement would be fundamental. The second social science insight. Social scientists have known for quite some time that attitudes predict about 10% of behavior at best. At best. That includes racial behaviors. Now that means that if we were to neutralize all the racial prejudice, implicit or explicit, that we would only get rid of about 10% of discriminatory behavior at best. And that leads me to my third social science insight, which is that situations are often more powerful predictors of behavior than character. And if we take those insights seriously, it means that in addition to focusing on training, we would also focus very heavily on the policies and understanding what policies lead to chronic situations, making people vulnerable to their own biases and stereotypes. Now, at the Center for Policing Equity, our goal has been to take these insights seriously. And the most notable success of that model is probably what led me to here in the first place, the aggregation of data. So the National Justice Database is the first national database to aggregate police stops and use of force. We now cover about 25% of the nation's population with those who are committed to doing that. But more importantly than creating that justice database, perhaps, is the way it came about, which is that law enforcement executives, chiefs, commissioners, and sheriffs came together and said, we need this. We want to do it in the best, most objective scientific way. And they came to the scientists to ask for our help. So what concretely would I ask the task force to do in light of these promising observations? Again, I'll have a different set of 3 asks. First, I would ask that the task force encourage federal funding to aggregate national statistics on policing, such as the Justice Database. Second, I would ask that the task force encourage federal stakeholders to facilitate more opportunities for law enforcement communities to learn from social scientists and vice versa, because this evidence base is only growing. And third, I would ask the task force to recommend expanding technical and financial assistance to law enforcement departments that want to benefit from the growth of this evidence-based approaches to fairness, but lack the means to follow through on their intentions. CPE doesn't ever take money from our law enforcement partners. But we are constantly approached by departments that can't even afford to task a lieutenant with being a project liaison. So if we want to take seriously that law enforcement wants to do the right thing, I hope that the task force will recommend that there are the means to accomplish that. So I began by saying that as a scientist, an important question without a satisfactory answer is anathema. I do not believe that social science is the answer, but I do believe that it can help set the table for divining what those answers would be, and I hope that the task force allows us the space to continue doing that. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goff. Our next witness is Jim McDonnell, who is the sheriff for LA County. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here today. Commissioner Ramsey, Professor Robinson, and other distinguished task members, thank you for allowing me to be able to address you today. Nearly 3 months ago, I was sworn in as LA County's 32nd sheriff, the first person in over a century elected from outside of the Sheriff's Department. I took command of a law enforcement agency facing many challenges. I also took command of an agency that's flown below the radar for years, not always acknowledged for its cutting-edge work and expertise. So I speak to you today as both a new sheriff with an agenda driven by the need for a change, as well as somebody who's become fiercely proud of the organization I'm now privileged to lead. The Los Angeles Sheriff's Department is the largest sheriff's department in the country and the second largest policing agency in the nation. We serve a county spanning over 4,000 square miles with a population of over 10 million people. We also run the nation's largest jail system, police 42 of LA's cities, and protect the safety of the nation's largest court system. Today I want to focus on what managing a complex law enforcement organization as well as a large jail system has taught us about the challenges and opportunities facing policing. While we clearly need more resources and support, we're equally in need of fresh thinking and new strategies that can enable us to rethink the job of policing and learn from each other as we do so. The LA jail system provides housing for up to 20,000 inmates in 7 facilities. We are facing many challenges. Our inmates include rival gang members and are of varying security and threat levels. Most of our facilities are antiquated. Past poor management resulted in unacceptable inmate abuse, and recidivism rates are far too high. Many in our custody need to be separated from society, but others are there because society has left them behind. For too long and too many, jail has become a default placement and the latest step in a recurring cycle. While I've seen these challenges, I've also seen how far we've come. We have education programs that enabled over 300 inmates to secure high school diplomas last year. We're also increasing drug treatment programs, targeting the homeless for housing assistance and enhancing reentry planning. These efforts are happening despite the environment in which we work, not because of it. Yet we can and we must do more, but we can't get there alone. We need federal help, including support for new correctional treatment facilities rather than jails where we simply warehouse offenders. We need flexible funding streams that enable us to address medical and mental health concerns of those in our charge, and resources to expand education, vocational training, and reentry planning that can chart a better future for those returning to the community. In Los Angeles' jails, we're also running what amounts to the largest mental health facility in the nation. We house over 3,500 inmates in need of mental health services. Yet jails were not built as treatment centers or with long-term care in mind. We are similarly ill-equipped to address the challenges of this population in patrol. Patrol personnel lack mental health training, and we have a dearth of mental evaluations or MET teams and community supports to help deputies de-escalate contacts with the mentally ill. We need crisis intervention training so deputies working the streets know how to respond to the mentally ill and, wherever possible, divert them from the justice system. We need support for MET teams and community-based resource centers where we can create a comprehensive response to those in crisis, and strategies that focus on alternatives to incarceration. Finally, we need to focus on our next generation and those exposed to trauma and violence. Too many youth are exposed to a level of violence equivalent to that of a war zone. While the young person may not have been physically struck, we know that their brains are permanently damaged by exposure to violence. Law enforcement needs to strengthen communities so that they are and feel safe. We must realize that our responsibility does not end when the yellow tape comes down. Violent crime has many victims, and we must do more to support them. We must recognize that every interaction we have shapes the future, both of individuals and of our community.
Law enforcement must be trained on how to interact with young people in crisis and those who are trauma impacted. We need to tailor our response to the age and characteristics of the individual, and we need to help support an environment in which our children can learn, develop, and thrive, and move away from punitive approaches that push young people out of schools and into our justice system. Our founding fathers wrote that governments derive their powers from the consent of the governed. As this timeless message reminds us, whatever authority we have is granted to us and derived from our community. Community-oriented policing is not something we do on the side. It's how a department should operate. We must police with and not merely in the communities that we serve. Peace officers don't tend to want to ask for help, but to do what is expected of us in today's challenging times, we must acknowledge that we need help. So I'm here today to thank you for your work, your wisdom, and your help, and I welcome any questions at the end of this that you may have. Thank you for this opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sheriff. Dr. Daniel Nagin is our next witness, and he's a professor at Carnegie Mellon. Welcome.
First of all, let me indicate how gratified I was to receive this invitation to be on this distinguished panel. More than 250 years ago, the Enlightenment philosopher Cesar Beccaria admonished, "It is better to prevent crimes than punish them." I recently co-authored an essay with Cynthia Lum of George Mason University titled Reinventing American Policing, a 6-point blueprint for the 21st century. In it, we lay out an ambitious blueprint for reorienting police towards Beccaria's goal. The blueprint also aims to advance another important objective of policing, maintenance of high levels of credibility and confidence in the communities that they are sworn to protect. Both objectives form the bedrock of effective policing in a democratic society. U.S. criminal justice policy of the past 4 decades institutionalized many characteristics of today's criminal justice system. For law enforcement, the function of arrest became a central measure of performance. Even ideas like broken windows policing that were in preventative intent came to be applied in ways that police knew best: zero tolerance and arrest for even the most minor crimes. Reorienting police practice towards crime prevention and improving community trust requires important changes in the functions, values, and operations of law enforcement. The 6-point blueprint that we lay out is grounded in decades of research and 2 principles. Principle 1 is that crime prevention, not arrest, is paramount. Crimes averted, not arrests made, should be the primary metric for judging police success in meeting their objective to prevent crime and disorder. The second principle is that citizen reactions matter. Citizen response to the police and their tactics for preventing crime matter, independent of police effectiveness in these functions. Principle 1 follows from Beccaria's observation that it is better to prevent crimes than punish them. Punishment is costly to all involved: society at large that must pay for it, the individual who must endure it, and also the police whose time is diverted from their crime prevention function. While arrest plays a role in crime prevention, arrest also signifies failure of prevention. If a crime is prevented in the first place, so is arrest and all the ensuing costs of punishment. Principle 1 does not suggest that police should stop making arrests. An important function of the police, besides crime prevention, is bringing the perpetrators of crime to justice. Further, police cannot possibly prevent all crimes. However, over the past 3 decades, a steady accumulation of evidence suggests that proactive prevention activities are more effective than reactive arrests in preventing crime. Proactive policing activities focus efforts on people, places, times, and situations that are a high risk of offending. Proactive policing stands in sharp contrast to reactive approaches in that it tries to address the problems before they beget further crimes through a variety of strategies that often do not emphasize arrest. Thus, in this first principle, we suggest greater emphasis on proactive and preventive deployment strategies than arrest-based deployment strategies. Principle 2 emphasizes that police and democracies are not only responsible for preventing crime, but also for maintaining their credibility with all segments of the citizenry. The objective of maintaining citizen trust and confidence means that the reactions of citizens to the police is important to judging their effectiveness, independent of their success in preventing and solving crime. While citizen trust and confidence may facilitate police effectiveness in preventing crime. We treat trust and confidence as important in its own right because the overriding objective of policing should be to create a safe democratic society, not a safe police state. In emphasizing the importance of citizen confidence and trust in the police, we are fully cognizant that police citizens' encounters may be hostile through no fault of the police officer. These encounters may involve people who have committed or are in the process of committing serious crimes, and may involve real threats to the safety of police officers and innocent bystanders. However, even in these circumstances, the person who poses a threat or is responsible for the hostile interaction does not forfeit his or her status as a citizen, even if his or her behavior provides a legal basis for arrest or even lethal police response. In putting forth these two principles, we are cognizant of the difficulty of what must be done to achieve them. The three functions of police, preventing crime, bringing the perpetrators of crime to justice, and maintaining their credibility and trust with the police are each significant in their own right and also highly dependent upon one another. However, a recognition of the difficulty of what must be done to advance these principles should not be used as an excuse for dismissing their pursuit as quixotic. In my written testimony that you have before you, I've summarized the six blueprint items, but let me just say briefly that the first is prioritizing prioritizing crime prevention over arrest, and the second is creating systems for monitoring citizen reaction to the police and reporting results back to public and line officers. And then the other bullet items elaborate upon innovations in training, organizational incentives, and management items, and the national research infrastructure on policing to advance these goals. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nagin. As Ron Davis noted, we've had over 150 witnesses at our listening sessions, but I think our next witness has come the furthest of anyone who has come before the panel. Dr. Lawrence Sherman is a professor at Cambridge University in the United Kingdom. Welcome.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Thank you, members of the task force. And I hasten to add that I'm also a professor at the University of Maryland, and it is my bicontinental resident status that leads me to note that while Dr. Goff is quite right, we don't know how many people were killed by the police in the United States in the year 2013. The estimates range from a low of 461 that was reported to the FBI and estimates of over 1,000 that were compiled from newspaper clippings. In that same year, the other country I live in, the state, actually, of England and Wales within the United Kingdom, and that's an important point, the number of people killed by police in England and Wales that year was 0. 55 million people, 140,000 police, thousands of armed situations, thousands of situations to which armed police responded. Not one person was killed. This is a comparison that is crying out for an explanation. Maybe my explanation doesn't sustain the level of policy conclusions that I'm going to suggest to you, but I think it's inescapable that there's a massive difference in the infrastructure of policies and institutions governing the police in England and Wales and the infrastructure governing the United States. I think we have to have a conversation at the institutional level that transcends specifics of training and other options, but does start with a fundamental policy difference in terms of deadly force. The policy in the UK is similar at law to the policy in the US, which is essentially that you can kill in defense of life. But the ride along with that policy in England and Wales is essentially that if you are killing somebody for an offense that they're not being willing to be arrested for, that is essentially trivial, then you're doing the wrong thing. Even at the moment you pull the trigger, you may be in defense of life. You put yourself in a position where you had no choice. And that's not allowed in the UK. Neither is the idea of continuing a confrontation that may not be necessary to actually apprehend somebody, so that de-escalation as well as proportionality are key principles. And what I'd like to recommend in my remaining time is a series of federal, state, and local actions that could in effect, test the hypotheses about what's done in the UK and how they would work in this country. First, at the federal level, I would propose the President issue 4 executive orders. The first executive order would be for the 120,000 employees of federal law enforcement agencies to adopt the English standards of proportionality and de-escalation in shooting, which is more restrictive than the current defense of life policy. Secondly, I think the President should create a National College of Policing, which would provide a certification through a 3-month course of anybody who would serve as a police chief of a certified police agency in the United States. Third, the President would ask the college to issue standards that are compiled from the 50 state post boards. Actually, there's not 50 of them yet, but that's a recommendation to the states to finish that job. And fourth, that the federal government establish a register of people who've been dismissed from federal law enforcement agencies, which would be accessible to anybody who's screening applicants for employment in police agencies at federal, state, and local levels. For the states, I think they should adopt something England has had since 1856. That's an Inspector General of Police who, until very recently, had the power to decertify police agencies so they would lose all of their national funding. That certification would be something that I think the states could require, and similarly, they could require the chiefs of police of agencies that are, in effect, creatures of the state, including all local government, the chiefs would have to meet some certification if there wasn't one made available by the national government, that there would be some other certification, and the mandatory standards, including things like the deadly force standard that I recommended, would be part of the post-board authority. In England and Wales, we have a statewide independent police complaints commission, which gets around a lot of the issues of local commissions, and the states could do that. They could have their own register of dismissed officers and contribute to the federal register. And most radically, I think it's very important that a lot of the killings by of citizens by police come from small agencies, and I think we need to go with a minimum of 100 employees for each police agency so that you could have adequate standards for vetting candidates, for training, certifying, and disciplining them at the level that you see with extraordinary success in places like New York City that used to kill upwards of 80 people a year and are now killing an average of less than 10. That doesn't happen with small agencies being able to change the way it can in a big agency where you have the training and the supervision. I have similar recommendations for local agencies, but I thank you very much for your consideration of these specific ways in which actions could be taken now that could have a big impact in saving the lives of young people in the United States in unnecessary, tragic, illegitimate, albeit possibly legal, confrontations with the police. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sherman. Our final witness on this panel is President Jeremy Travis of John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the welcome, Co-Chair Ramsey, Co-Chair Robinson, members of the task force. I'm delighted and honored to have been asked to appear on this, now I know, last witness on the last panel, and to be on this panel with my colleagues. I have one thank you and 3 recommendations. So the thank you is to offer thanks to the Department of Justice for the opportunity provided by a grant provided to John Jay College, leading a consortium of Yale Law School, UCLA, and the Urban Institute to launch the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice. This is, if we're thinking today about looking forward, this is, in my estimation, one of the most important undertakings of the Justice Department. And on behalf of my colleagues, some of whom are here, Tracey Meares is a member of our consortium, Bryan Stevenson's on our advisory board. I just want to express our appreciation. We had our first meeting of the advisory board last week. It was a exciting, sobering, and humbling opportunity to think forward. And I thank the COPS office and the other OJP agencies for this initiative. And we hope to learn a lot in the 5 sites to be selected, soon to be named, and the national undertaking that we will provide to the nation. And let me recognize also that Phil Goff is also a partner there. So recommendation number 1 may not surprise you, coming from a president of a institution of higher education, which is that education matters. And predecessor task forces that were named by other presidents long ago, after similar times of urban strife and concern about the role of the policing, have all recommended in different ways or others that it's important to have an educated profession of people who carry out the work of enforcing our laws. College I head up, John Jay, was founded 50 years ago after one of those commissions made that recommendation. It was then a radical idea that a college-educated police officer would be a better police officer. That idea, I think, still resonates today, and that we need to provide opportunities, as we are for STEM disciplines, for returning veterans. This is an important profession, and we need a national investment in the education of police officers. I would also echo what Dr. Sherman indicated, and at our advisory board last meeting, Jim Bierman of the Police Foundation also referenced, which is the need for what in some writing I've done we've called national cohesion, a way of thinking about this as a nationally important profession. There's very little national attention. The COPS office does the best it can, but it's not really thinking about standards, about research, about developing leadership. Jim proposed, as did Larry and would I, a police commission. The closest we have is the FBI executive academy, and that's not the same thing as a way to build the leadership of this nationally important profession. So universities can make a difference to develop that sort of capability. My second recommendation also won't surprise you. Having been the director of the National Institute of Justice, serving under Assistant Attorney General Robinson with Attorney General Reno, I am a strong believer in the importance of research, and would echo what my fellow panelists have said. The amount of research that we funded under the '94 Crime Act was historic, but pitiful. When we think what we could have known had we invested more, had there been more money made available, if we were like any other research institute, able to invest in the basic understanding of this important relationship between government and citizen, it's really sobering. So, of course, we should invest more in research. We learned a lot in those days. But I think what this panel would recommend, I think, is that today's research agenda should be much broader and different from that funded by the '94 Crime Act. Today, we need an empirical understanding of the interactions between the police and the public that we don't have at all. And I echo what Dr. Goff has stated here, and have learned a lot from Tracey Meares' research, and actually was Professor Sherman who first brought this issue of legitimacy to my attention when the University of Maryland did its What Works in Crime Prevention study. We just do not understand the interactions, the retail interactions of law enforcement and the police. So that's the goal for the next generation. But let me focus on the third recommendation that I highlight in my prepared statement. The title of today's panel is The Future of Community Policing. So this is the conceptual framework for the police revolution that's taken place over the last generation. There are three aspirations articulated there. One is embracing crime prevention. We've talked about that a lot, and we have great successes in reducing crime in this country through problem solving as the principal policing methodology. So those two pillars are very strong. But the third pillar, which is partnerships with the community, has gotten less attention. It's underdeveloped. In some ways, I think that we've lost ground while the others have gained ground. So we need to think about strengthening that pillar. So how do we do that? I think we focus on legitimacy, which we've talked about here today, procedural justice, which we've talked about. And I in my testimony, cite the statement made by Bill Bratton when he was sworn in as the police commissioner for a second time, a year ago exactly. He said he has come back to New York because he's troubled by the observation, his personal observation, the realization that although crime has been reduced to record lows, in people in communities, particularly communities of color, particularly young people in communities of color, are angry at the police. How could this be, he asks, when we've done so well, in his view? How could it be that there is such dissatisfaction? So we've talked about this. Actually, we've talked about it at John Jay with Make the Road colleagues about the stop and frisk era and this increase in misdemeanor arrests, but it's different. It's deeper than that. So in addition to procedural justice and legitimacy, what I argue for in this testimony, and we take on under the national initiative, is to imagine a process of racial reconciliation, to imagine a process that brings police and community together, not in the way that is sort of the easy way of community councils and public opinion polls, but really getting to the deep distrust between the police and communities of color that exists for a long time. I'll just end with a quote from my colleague David Kennedy, who on a radio show said, when there's one of these incidents that we've seen all too often and that brought us to into being today with the president's directive of a young, unarmed African-American man killed by the police, maybe justifiable, maybe not, white America talks about the incident. What happened? Was it legally justifiable? What does the grand jury do? Black America talks about history. And it's that history that matters. So we have to think about ways to bring history into conversations constructively. Very difficult. I don't pretend expertise here, but I think that's the imperative of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, President Travis. We're going to turn now to questions from our panel. I'll be calling on people in the order in which they indicated to me that they wanted to raise questions. I'm going to be starting with Brittany Packnett, followed by Sue Rahr. Brittany?
Thank you so much for your testimony. I have two questions. The first is for Dr. Nagin. I'm a pastor's kid, and so I was taught very early that wherever your treasure is stored up, that's where your heart is, and translated into the work that I do now and in kind of operations and systems, right? Whatever we measure, that's what we value. And so my question is really around this idea of measuring crime prevention. And I want to know how we can viably measure crime prevention in a way that does not provide a perverse incentive to support kind of predatory, broken windows policing that has led to issues like stop and frisk and the aggressive traffic stops that I see in my native St. Louis County, and instead measurement that incentivizes community policing and guardianship.
Thank you for the question. With regard to the issue of measuring prevention, first of all, I'll acknowledge as a researcher, and for those of you who know the kind of research I do, that's a very hard thing to do. But in this context, I do think real headway can be made on it, and it begins with actually some of the research that Larry Sherman had begun with. If you, for example, target places or people at high risk of offending, you can see whether your efforts to reduce crime at those locations, was effective. So by having targeted strategies, you can do that. With regard to the second part of your question, using tactics which don't emphasize arrest. I mean, I think arrest is an inevitable part of policing, but don't emphasize it. Here again, these kinds of proactive strategies, which I should say that my co-author, Cynthia Luminous, has summarized in a very nice website at George Mason University. They involve things like problem solving, changes in the physical environment with lighting and things like that, or bringing third parties in, like landlords and so forth, to try to mitigate the places that generate crime, and by doing that, not only by avoiding the crime, also avoiding having to make arrests because there's no crime, and do not emphasize policing in which there are a large number of arrests that are made for minor crimes.
Thank you. And my second question is for Professor Sherman. I'm really interested in your written testimony, recommendation number 10. You talk about an executive order on deadly force, and that executive order should focus on both proportionality of the force used and an emphasis on de-escalation before force is a choice that's made. And so I'm wondering if you could just kind of discuss that a bit more, and if that executive order were in existence, what would that mean in cases like the killing of Meares Rice in Cleveland, where the shooting actually occurred about 2 seconds after the officer arrived?
This idea, and I'm very glad you gave me a chance to give some examples, is very important. It goes back to Mayor Bradley in Los Angeles discussing the report on higher education for police in 1979, right after a woman named Eula Love was killed by police because she hadn't paid her gas bill, and when the gas man came to turn the gas off, she took a shovel and told him to leave, and he wouldn't, and so she whacked him with this shovel on his arm, so he called the police. And when the police pulled up, she appeared in the front door of her house with a knife, and the police pulled out their guns and pointed them at her and said, "Drop the knife." And she didn't, so they shot her and killed her. Now, there's more details to it, but essentially, it's an example of an argument that can be made that there was a threat to life, but it was an unnecessary confrontation because the police could have used other tactics to de-escalate the situation. So number one, it was disproportionate to the underlying offense, which was a simple assault, a misdemeanor assault, and certainly not worthy of in effect, a pretrial death penalty. But more importantly, perhaps, because there are situations where offenders kill people, and the police in London encountered somebody who had just beheaded an 80-year-old woman with a machete last year, and they managed to take that man into custody alive. Now, I put it to you, it would be very difficult for many police in the United States to do that, but the police were under this infrastructure that I'm talking about, which can make such a huge difference, not only in the letter of these policies, but in the spirit with which they are implemented, the expectations from the first day of training that police officers have in the UK, that their job is to keep people alive, no matter who they are.
Sue Rahr, followed by Cedric Alexander.
My question is for Professor Sherman as well. I have to say I was tantalized by your written testimony about putting limits on the size of police departments, but lower limits as opposed to upper limits. And one of the things that is fiercely protected in this country is local independence and local control. And we've had conversations amongst our colleagues about, you know, the concept of multiple agencies and the independence. And it seems that going to larger agencies moves us away from a close relationship with the community that you seem to get with this small department. And it seems that as the departments get larger, there's more anonymity that the officers have and would seem to create a distance. So I wonder if you could delve a little bit into how in the UK you do or don't maintain that close community relationship when you have such a large agency and perhaps so much movement from one community to the next.
I'm so glad you asked that, because my first job with the New York City Police Department in 1971 was to evaluate Police Commissioner Patrick Murphy's neighborhood police team program, which is exactly what is done in police forces of 1,000 or 5,000 or 8,000 or 40,000 in the UK. And when you take it down to the neighborhood level, it's sort of like the adage of a former Speaker of the House, which is that all politics are local and all policing is local. And if you organize your policing to maximize face-to-face interaction between the police responsible for an area and the citizens they're serving, you don't have to have a small agency to do that. Arguably, you'll get more equity in providing that kind of interaction if you have a larger agency that's looking at things like the fairness of the distribution of the resources, so that the effort in the UK since the last effort like this, which was a royal commission over scandals of police in smaller departments getting too close to the community leaders, not just corruption, but also preference and bias. And it was before Britain was 15% black and minority ethnic, as the term is phrased there, which now leads even more complexity in terms of bias in favor of one group versus another, which is the allegation in Ferguson, a predominantly white government serving a predominantly African-American community. If you have larger entities, for example, the St. Louis County level, of responsibility for all of the different areas, say, outside of St. Louis City, then there is, I think, more checks and balances. And the point I want to make about localism, there's really 2 points. One is that this proliferation of tiny police agencies is not something we've always had. It's mostly since World War II that we had the luxury of putting first 1 and then 3 or 5 police officers in small towns all over Pennsylvania, where there's 1,800 police departments for 10 million people. And that is something that if you want to cut taxes, you'd merge police departments and have a single call center for the county. It's one of the easiest way to cut taxes around the country right now. And that financial aspect of it might change the game, rather than just saying that the locals have all this power, we can't touch it. The fact is, it's a decision for 50 state legislatures to make, because they are the ones who create cities. Legally, it's a creature of the state, and they can amalgamate cities if they want to. Of course, they've got politics to worry about. But if one state or two states wants to be bold enough to take this vision to cut taxes and to improve the equity in policing by having larger police departments, the whole country will benefit by following suit.
Can I follow up with how does the local community exercise control over their policing?
I think there's a wonderful series of institutions that we see in England and Wales, including a police complaints commission and including an inspectorate of constabulary that is looking at these things. And the latest institution that I think we have to say the jury is still out on is elected police and crime commissioners for, in effect, 42 of the 43 local forces. The deputy mayor for policing of London is the counterpart of the elected police and crime commissioners in all of the other forces. And those elections are controversial because they were introduced out of cycle. They only had a 15% turnout. There's lots of other questions raised by it, but they replaced a board of about 18 locally elected city and county council members who were the board of directors for the police department. So you've got the democracy under any model you want to look at throughout British history, even before 2012 when we changed to the elected police and crime commissioners. So there's lots of ways to do this. The states can look at this if they want to create a more cost-effective form of policing that I think will have more checks and balances for more equitable policing.
Our next questioner is Cedric Alexander, followed by Roberto Villaseñor.
Again, good morning. Here's a question for each of you, particularly those of you with academic backgrounds and have done much work and research over the years as it relates to your profession. You know, oftentimes what I've seen, even going back to my days at University of Miami and University of Rochester where I trained, is that a lot of research is compiled among academics, but it tends not to go very far other than, you know, a lot of interesting discoveries are made as it relates to how to improve our society, make things better for all of us. But I think that some of you will agree, in whole or part, that oftentimes, Dr. Goff, a lot of this research doesn't get out where it could be of some real benefit. So we're in a real crisis place, is my opinion, in this country as it relates to police-community relations. And it's not getting any better. It's becoming more challenged. And hopefully what we're all going to do here is do something to kind of move things along and provide some guidance as to what we need to do to make things better. But I would even say, too, to Sheriff McDonnell, you're the practitioner. You're the one who takes all this research, people like yourself, I, and others who are CEOs in our own agencies. But we're not getting that information. So how do we take all this wonderful research that you are coming up with and make it applicable, make it come alive? I mean, it's great stuff, but how do we make that transition from academia and putting it into the community where it's going to evolve into something, and it's something that's got to happen really quickly. So I just like to get y'all thoughts and insights into that, and you're welcome to start, Dr. Goff.
Well, thank you for that question. I'll answer in, I guess, 2.5 parts. The first, echoing the words of President Travis, the national initiative is choosing 5 sites to do intervention research in, but there's also a clearinghouse function of the national initiative. So the goal is to have a central place where people who are looking for research or the best practices or just the emerging trends in this evidence base, the emerging evidence base, can go and say, what do we know? And there can be a firm answer about that. So I think that that's a good step towards being able to translate it. But I think the key question here is the point 2.5, is that translation is quite difficult. And I don't think it's just because academics publish in journals that only 7 people read. I think it's because academics are a group of people who are picked last to kickball and do not develop social skills in the same way that other people do. So it's not just that we talk to each other, we don't even talk to each other. There is therefore a profound need to establish regular modes of communication, not just between law enforcement and researchers, but between law enforcement communities and researchers. Because there needs to be a kind of cross-pollination of literacy on not just the academic issues, but on the community issues and the law enforcement issues. One of the things that we get a chance to see, and we saw just last week at the National Initiative board meeting, is that you have community groups who have a language for this. You have law enforcement who has a language for this. You have researchers who have a language for this. That's 3 different languages all trying to talk about the same thing and the same set of issues. And that's with people who are already on the same page. Because we don't work together, because we don't go together, we don't know. My dad has a phrase, and I'll end with this. He's a philosopher, so forgive me and him. But he says, if you want to be a philosopher, go where philosophers go. We got that from William James. I'm not suggesting any of us become philosophers. But I am saying that if we want to understand each other, if we want to be able to translate, we need to be in the same place talking about that. And because there's no national sort of conference or convening that's with any kind of regularity, then there's no short-term urgent response, and there's definitely no long-term process for it.
Thank you for the opportunity. In listening to that, you know, I look at where we are today as a data-driven society, and I think there's tremendous value to that. The challenge is, much as we focused on in the community policing arena, is that we don't focus just on numbers to drive the way we do business, because if we ask for numbers, we'll generally get numbers, but it may not be what we actually want in the long term. We need to focus on outcomes rather than outputs. And in doing so, I think the challenge for us as practitioners is taking the data and making it applicable, translating it to how do we use that in the field? How do we use it in a way that we get the greatest value for the resources that are employed, and also from a justice perspective, what does that mean in the delivery of police services to the communities that we serve? Going back to evidence-based strategies, certainly that we can take data, we can focus on best practices, we need to share those, we need a forum to be able to do that. But in looking at, in the absence of using data as a sole criteria for judging an organization or an individual officer or deputy in the field, what are the other options? And I would suggest community surveys and other means to be able to determine how the community feels about their police and how the community feels about their safety. So I think it's a complex conversation to have. Certainly welcome the data, but also to be able to put it in context so we can make it meaningful without having the data drive solely the way we do business. Thank you.
It's an excellent question, and I'll respond with 2 levels. One is the most recently fully appointed NIJ director, John Laub, emphasized the idea of translational, criminology, and there have been places in universities that have picked up on that challenge, and in particular, my co-author, Cynthia Lum at George Mason University, is actively involved with the Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy, and are doing a number of really, I think, quite remarkable ways of communicating the implications of academic research, for police practice. But I think it also needs to go beyond that. And in my, the written testimony, I emphasize the need, and sort of I think it echoes some themes we've heard throughout, is that we need a much larger national infrastructure for dissemination, not unlike at the National Institutes of Health, where they do not only basic research, but an important part of their mission is dissemination of that research and its implications, for medical practice. I think that there needs to be something comparable here as well. If I may, just to pick up on the idea of community surveys, and this, if I may just speak briefly to Susan's point about maybe the difficulties of having larger organizations. In my testimony, we talk about the need for collecting systematic data on citizen reactions and using it in the evaluation, performance evaluation of the police officers. And so one thing you could do in this regard is that when you replace these, the police departments of small towns with a larger organization, you can still collect information systematically on the reactions of the people in that community and whether they're satisfied with the performance of the police.
I should have said that actually just about every police force in England and Wales does that. They do an annual survey. They can go down to areas as small as a census tract. So they can pick up the fact that in one part of the country where you have predominantly Muslim neighborhoods, the trust and confidence in the police is at extraordinarily low levels, and that actually corresponds to human intelligence about potential acts of terrorism being organized there. So you don't get that kind of knowledge of your community if you're breaking up the policing into lots of little bits that lack the coordinated strategy of thinking broadly across big population centers. But I did want to say that another answer to Dr. Alexander's question about getting the research applied in practice is to get the police involved in doing research, which we've been doing at Cambridge for almost 20 years now, but especially in recent years with a focus on evidence-based policies. We have police, like surgeons, like other people in the health professions, conducting their own experiments and publishing their own experiments, sometimes co-authors with academics, and really joining in enthusiasm with the idea of discovering new things about how to do policing better. Some of our graduates in 2010 founded the Society for Evidence-Based Policing. It mostly consists of police professionals. There's 2,000 members in 30 countries, including 500 in Australia and New Zealand, where there's huge interest, and they're demanding that we go down there and spend a fair amount of time. We're also in Latin America, where there's a huge interest in getting evidence-based practice into the policing of that continent. Parts of Asia, we've spent a lot of time in India. The only place that's not asking to have this kind of help from universities is the United States.
So this is one of my favorite topics, and let me see what I can add to what my colleagues have already said. First, just to state something that's, I think, fundamental, which is that we need independent sources of information about policing, independent of the police. All right, so this is actually piggybacking on your question, Ms. Packnett. So there's a lot of history in the room. If we remember back to the early 1970s when another group of federal officials decided to create the first victimization survey. We know so much about crime because we asked residents of communities about their experience with crime, and we don't rely on the police to tell us only what they report to the FBI. So that independent source of information about crime has benefited us enormously over the years, and we need a similar nationally normed independent survey of the experience of the interactions with the justice system. And I don't include just the police, because actually I'm as much concerned about mass incarceration and supervision as I am the police in terms of racial issues. But we need that independent source of information. So that's not a popularity poll. That's really going to the people in a regularly systematic way. This is the justice survey that Dr. Goff referred to. That needs a big investment, and it has to federal money, and it has to be the way that the police ask the question, how am I doing, right? So secondly, we talked a bit about the importance of what in this paper I wrote with Chris Stone we called national coherence, a set of national expectations that you can go to any police department and you expect that they would do certain things the way that best evidence would require. As you would go to any hospital and you expect a surgeon to know what is the latest best evidence about how to conduct a certain medical procedure. That national coherence requires a long time of building a body of evidence as to what is best practice. That comes along with this notion of a national sort of policing college that develops leaders. So what Professor Sherman said is the other important point here. There has to be, it's not a two-way street between two people that otherwise don't talk to each other. This is building a capacity and an appetite within police agencies to do their own research, to be data driven, and to partner with universities. So in the medical profession, we have the institution of the teaching hospital, where young doctors, are spending time in university, also learning in emergency rooms. So we've blended these two ways of thinking about the same phenomenon, one highly scholarly and one highly practice-oriented, so that we are learning from each other all the time. It's not a dissemination model, although that's important. It's really a collaborative model. So data infrastructure becomes very important there. We need to think about data. We need to think about operations research. But we need to really help police agencies recognize the importance of developing this what Professor Stone and I call the sort of the innovation sort of mentality, that we're always learning, which means we're always experimenting, which means we're always open to criticism and recognition when things don't work.
Thank you. Our next questioner is Roberto Villaseñor, followed by Bryan Stevenson.
Thank you. All the presentations were very informative. I have two questions. So the first one, Sheriff McDonnell, I heard you talk about corrections needs reform to combat recidivism. We need mental health training for patrol officers. We need ways to influence the youth. And, you know, Dr. Goff, I heard your talk about partnerships. So there's a lot of different elements of the entire criminal justice system that need to get involved in this reform movement. And as we've worked here and we've shared recommendations, written recommendations through the group SAI that's helping us, I see a lot of that come up where we're making suggestions outside of the traditional police world, and where we've often said in community policing, we can't arrest our way out of these type of problems. We have to look in a broader scale and a grander scale. And when we do that, I think we go far outside the traditional police realm. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on how we transition that from thought to action on a broader scale. Open that up to anyone.
I'll kick it off, I guess. In looking at the business we're in and the results that we're seeing, I think we need to look non-traditionally. The way we've been doing it has given us the results we have today. When you look at you know, kids at the earliest age, you know, the old axiom, you know, from the time you're born until the 3rd grade, you read to learn. For the rest of your life, you learn to read from up to 3rd grade, and then you read to learn. And there's nothing, I think, more impactful on success or failure is that piece. And so kids who start to fall off track at the 3rd and 4th grade, we see the outcome. They get into alcohol, drugs, and gangs and dysfunctional behavior. When you look at that, up to 70% of the people incarcerated in state prisons are either illiterate or functionally illiterate. The connection there is unmistakable. So we need to focus on what are not traditionally viewed as policing solutions. They're education solutions. They're nurturing young people at the earliest ages and setting them up for success. And then on the back end, when we have people that are incarcerated, what are we doing? We know they're coming back out into society. What are we doing to be able to get them ready to get back out in a different fashion than they came in? To be able, again, to set them up for a greater level of success than they would otherwise have. So I think we need to look differently than we have been and look at options that weren't on the table previously. And I think that's where a national evaluation and analysis of what are we trying to get to at the end of the day, rather than just how do we do our job a little bit better as we've been doing up to this point.
Can I try an answer to that as well? This is really building on the observation I just made about thinking about our incarceration policies. I think we have to, if we step back from the policing question that is in the title of this task force, I think it's important for us, and maybe this is not within your remit, but to recognize that the entire criminal justice system has changed enormously over the past 40 years. Professor Nagin and I were privileged to be members of the National Academy of Sciences panel on the causes and consequences of high rates of incarceration in the U.S. I was fortunate to chair that. And we've come through a time in our nation's history where we have used prison as a response to crime more than any other time in our history, and we stand now outside the experience of every Western democracy by a factor of 5 to 10-fold. So I spend a lot of time with 20-year-olds these days, 15,000 of them at John Jay, and I ask them questions like, what's it like growing up? They're more likely to have a parent in prison. They're more likely to have somebody under supervision in their family. They're more likely when they were in high school to have been at the receiving end of a more punitive disciplinary system in their schools. And so the young people coming up today have a very different personal experience with the justice system. So it's a truism to say we should think about how police interact with the rest of it. But I think the police bear a burden not of their making, which is that the justice system itself is a much bigger footprint. in the lives of young people, particularly in communities of color. So the police can do a lot of work, but they also are the front end of a system that has been much more punitive. Our panel recommended significant reduction in incarceration rates, and that's going to be tough. But that's the reality. And in my testimony, I cite the finding in our report that a African-American male high school dropout today has a 68% chance of spending at least a year in prison. This reality has never existed before in this country. So we need to recognize that some things have changed, and the police are, because they are the law enforcement agency of most direct contact with the citizens, are to some extent bearing a burden that they didn't make. And that's unfortunate, but I think we have to have this larger frame.
If I could just point out, the British police are actually a major player in offender management, both at the front end of the system and at the back end of the system. And they have succeeded in recent years in diverting somewhere between 40 and 50% of all of the people who actually receive a criminal conviction, but the process stops in the police station. There is no further prosecution. There's no chance of going to prison when the police make that decision. They have used a variety of programs, but one that has been tested in collaboration with the University of Maryland, and the project director of it's in the room, Molly Slothauer, has just completed a randomized trial to see whether, if in fact the police come up with a kind of pre-prosecution probation program starting the day they're arrested, rather than waiting 9 months to have the case go to court, and with lots of delays and dismissals of the cases. There may be a major opportunity to keep the offenders under the watchful eye of neighborhood police officers who know where they are, and who, in a recent experiment in Philadelphia, demonstrated that they could get bigger crime reductions in hotspots of policing by more contact with offenders, not necessarily making arrests, but just making this connection clear so that there is a sense that you better stay out of trouble. And that's something that's reinforced with people coming out of longer prison terms in Britain, but sadly not for people with short-term incarceration for less than a year, many of whom can be diverted at the front end, which is where I think a lot of the evidence and innovation is being directed in British policing. So it's not just a matter of putting the people in jail, it's a matter of keeping them out of jail, which is going right back to Professor Nagin's point about the fundamental goal of the police is prevention of the crimes in the first place, and not taking some satisfaction. Sir Robert Peel says you shouldn't be bragging about the number of people you arrest. It's really the crimes that don't happen.
I'd like to pick up on both Larry's comments and Jeremy's as well. Is about 5 years ago, I published a paper along with an economist, Stephen Durloff, called "Imprisonment and Crime Can Both Be Reduced." And in that paper, we argued made the conclusion that was ultimately from our imprisonment panel, that lengthy prison sentences were neither an effective or an efficient way of preventing crime, but that there was a lot of evidence that if you use the police properly, you can prevent crime from happening in the first place. After publishing that essay, I started getting a lot of pushback from people saying, well, if you start emphasizing policing, aren't they just going to start arresting lots more people, and shoving them through the criminal justice system? And that's what, started getting me much more interested in policing. And when you look at the data, is just remember that every year there are 11 to 12 million arrests in the United States, but less than 20% of them are for felonies. Most of them are, for misdemeanors and more minor crimes. And one thing that's happened, accompanying the big increase in imprisonment, there's been a comparable increase in jail population over the same period, and that these kinds of arrests for these minor crimes, while they rarely wind up being in prison, they wind up being in Sheriff McDonnell's jails, and with all the problems that are associated with it, which is why we need to, as Larry said and I said, we need to use policing methods that prevent crime from happening, so that there's no arrest, and
The second question I have is probably geared a little bit more towards Dr. Sherman. And it was in regard when you talked about the numbers and the comparison between Great Britain and the United States. I agree with Sue. Those numbers are fascinating. I think there's a lot further research that we need to do in that area and find out some of the basis. But when you also talked about the incident with the beheading and that they're able to take that individual in custody, and you made the remark that, you know, that may not happen so much in America. I push back a little on that because I know within my own agency, quite often, we take people into custody in deadly force situations without using deadly force ourselves, and I'm sure it happens across the country, but we don't hear about those things because it doesn't satisfy the American media's appetite for violence. And that is, I guess, my question is, what do you feel about the difference maybe in what you see, because you're in a unique position to compare the two systems? Is there that same fascination in Great Britain and that, you know, that old adage that if it bleeds, it leads, and that's what you see on American media, and does that portray or affect the portrayal of policing?
I think the size of the audience for the newspapers in Britain and their financial success compared to the U.S. actually make them the most feral, barbaric media to be found in the English-speaking language anywhere on earth. And everything good that I'm saying about the British police is completely off limits for reporting in the British newspapers. One British paper picked up on my testimony today, but certainly not the others that are on an announced anti-police campaign. But I think your point about how, yes, there are many police agencies, no doubt places like Tucson and Los Angeles County, where there would be outstanding handling of mentally ill people, which is what this fellow was who beheaded that lady. And there is relatively no hope that good news like that will get reported. We're working with Trinidad where they're killing quite a few people, and what we're introducing is bandages that the police can put quick clot on to try to save their lives, along with body-worn videos so they can have their own evidence that they've actually tried to save the life of somebody they've just shot. And I think that because it bleeds and leads on the evening news, that might be a way of these new technologies being brought together to make it very clear that the police aren't just trying to kill people, they're trying to save lives. And maybe a more concerted campaign to get that word out when it happens in the places that it does happen. I think the sort of broad swipe that you can accuse me fairly of having taken about how it would be less likely in the U.S. to happen is across the 17,000 police agencies, I think, correct. And I think that if we can drill down in these numbers, and we're doing this right now, to see whether the rates of killings of citizens per officer are higher in the smaller police agencies, the 75% of them that are under 25 officers, then I think we'll have even more evidence to support the idea of having bigger police agencies with more training, because dealing with mentally ill people, especially with weapons, is one of the most complicated. Brain surgery is nothing compared to dealing with a mentally ill person with a knife. I have enormous respect for anybody who has to do that. And because it's so complicated, I want to see a nationally coherent strategy of recruiting, training, and certifying highly skilled people who can do that work. Even if it's only a specialist team, which you have in a big agency, and they're the ones who are brought in while the responding officers keep things under control until the very skilled people can try to take that troubled person into custody.
Bryan Stevenson, followed by Tracey Meares.
Thank you. I've got two questions as well. The first, I'll start with directed at Sheriff McDonnell. I was really interested in your testimony about the challenges of this growing population of people who are in jail and the need for more dynamic services. We've got an increased number of people who have mental illness, et cetera. There are these interventions. I'd like to ask you what role your deputies play in the adjudication of people who are pre-trial. That is, do your people provide insight opinions, testimony about their experience with the incarcerated population. My experience is that that's not the norm. And I'd like to know what your folks do. And then I'd like your thoughts or anybody else's thoughts about whether changing the role of people who have the most intimate knowledge of people, who see their progression or lack thereof with regard to treatment and response to treatment on mental health issues or education or whatever the need is. It seems to me if we've got this population, we're going to be working in this intense way, we get the resources to provide these services, we want to do something with what we learn about that. And that's not currently the model. So I'd be interested in hearing, whether your folks play that role with the adjudication process and any thoughts you have about that. And then I'll just put my second question out there if we can hold it in our mind. The second question picks up with what Brittany asked about. I'm very, very impressed and very, very attracted to this notion of crime prevention over arrest. But I also share this concern that crime prevention often means targeting, it means engagement with community members that actually decreases the trust and the legitimacy. When I think about crime prevention, I think about a range of issues like, dealing with poverty, dealing with trauma, dealing with services, dealing with a large set of issues that impact behaviors, drug enforcement policies. And I'd be interested in hearing how you all think we should reconcile the fear that some of us have when we hear crime prevention unregulated by, did I commit a crime that would justify arrest, with the obvious good goal of limiting the number of people we arrest and obviously limiting the number of crimes that are committed.
Thank you. Just to touch on your first piece relative to the population of the LA County jails, the people who are in there for pretrial are about half the population we deal with. Of those numbers, we work very hard on various intervention methods, try and provide education as best we can to be able to help somebody be able to get a GED, to be able to supplement what they bring and give them a package moving forward better than what they got. We're heavy on programming, a heavy focus on education, and then also on the mental health piece, doing the best we can, working with the Department of Mental Health to be able to provide whatever it is we can to put them in a better position than they were when they got in. About 20% of our population, as I mentioned, are there because of their illness. That's something that we need to work very, very aggressively on, to be able to lobby for community-based mental health clinics, to be able to work with courts that focus on mental health so that they can triage people and prevent them from going into the system as a default mechanism, and rather be able to focus them on treatment in the community that'll be better for them in the long run and better for all of us in the long run. We focus on best practices. We focus on trying to be able to share success stories. I don't know that we do that nationally as well as we could, but we certainly want to be a partner with others across the country in sharing those. And certainly in the custody environment, the challenges are significant. We have a lot of work to do, and we look forward to working with others to be able not only to show what works, but what doesn't work as well and what hasn't in the past.
Yeah. Can I just follow up, though,
Sure.
on that? In individual cases, are you proactively reporting the success you see with a particular person who's a pretrial detainee or lack of success, either to the prosecutor, the judge, the defense attorney? If I contact you and say, look, your guy has been doing this, I want to have him come to court, and do you have a policy around that?
We don't, and we don't have a policy per se. I've been on the job now 3 months, so I'm still getting up to speed on what we have, what are the best practices in the field, and to ensure that we're in line with those. On an individual basis, there are some, we have people who come in from the community who are experts in a variety of different specialties, who work with our incarcerated folks to be able to provide a variety of different services and programs to them. Pre-trial, they could subpoena somebody to be able to come in and say, based on my interaction with this person, I feel that they're in a better position or not. But to be able to have, I think, a coherent program to be able to address those issues, we have work to do in that regard as well.
Can I take on your second question, Professor Stevenson? So police are responsible, among others, for public safety. So Robert Peel's been mentioned a couple times, talk about history, and that was his first principle, that your job is to prevent crime. You raise a question, however, which is, what is the role of the exercise of police powers in the prevention of crime? And that's in part I'll call it a research question, which is, to what extent does the exercise of police powers, the power to arrest in this case, and there are other police powers, but let's call it that one, to what extent does that or does it not result in a behavioral change such that you can say that there's actually been a prevention of crime, there's been a reduction in crime. There's more research that can be done, but there's been a fair amount of research that's been done by people at this table on hotspots policing, on ways to exercise that power in a strategic way with crime prevention, crime reduction as the goal. And I, for one, don't shy away from acknowledging that the police are authorized and expected and deputized, in essence, by us, with our consent, to use those powers in ways that will produce safety. What we've not done adequately is, in my view, is to ask the corollary question that I think this entire panel is saying is important for the country, which is to say, what are the costs of that exercise of police power, such that you can say, well, at some point, maybe there are bad things happening as we use that power to reduce crime that have to be somehow balanced against a benefit. Complicated balance, but we don't even have the data to be able to know what's the cost in, you mentioned, what's the cost of legitimacy? What's the cost in trust? What's the cost in the willingness of people to cooperate with the police, to report crimes? How does all of this sort of feed into the stop snitching movement, right? So we don't have an understanding of some of the costs of the legitimate exercise of police power, even if it's in the name of a good thing called crime reduction or crime prevention, and even if we know that that has actually happened. So I think there's a challenge. Actually, I was at our institution last night giving the Hoffinger lecture, to be followed by Dan Nagin soon, and I said one of the things that comes out of the National Academy report for me is the imperative of rethinking the criminal sanction in terms of its ability to change behavior. And it's not just an automatic reflexive, we're going to put somebody away for a long time, even though, another sort of personal statement, at some point we have to say that retribution is a legitimate social purpose. But we need to constrain and limit, use the principle of parsimony to really limit the exercise of state power. So the director of the COPS office, Chief Davis, said at the outset we're thinking about public safety and trust at the same time. These two things are independent objectives that we hold for the police. We don't understand trust enough. We don't have measures of trust enough. We know that we have public safety benefits. We're not sure really how much the police have contributed to those public safety declines that we've seen recently, but we can't hold up the public safety benefit and therefore say we don't care about trust. And my sense is that actually we can do a lot to get more public safety benefit and get increased trust, which is what the national initiative is trying to figure out, with fewer arrests, shorter sentences, fewer people in jail, that we can use a lot of the resources that Roberto was talking about before, mental health resources, like to respond to troubled people in much more productive ways than we do now. So this is a failure of imagination. We just haven't sort of figured it out, but it's also a failure of expectation, that we need to say that we expect this of our enforcement agencies. And it's not just the police, it's the child protective services people who show up, it's the probation people who show up, it's the school safety officers who show up. All of those public servants can be held to that same expectation of providing for safety and promoting trust and confidence at the same time.
I'd like to speak. The issue you raise, the second issue you raise, is the central theme of the essay that I wrote with Cynthia. And in that essay, we delineate three important functions of the police: prevention of crime, bringing the perpetrators of crime to justice, and maintaining community trust. And we describe them as being independent functions, each important in their own right. And in doing that, we recognize that there may well have to be trade-offs between these in ways that Jeremy was talking about. But they're both important, and specifically, one thing we avoided doing, and we said that one objective doesn't trump the other objective, that they have to be balanced. And we resisted, for example, emphasizing too much the argument that if there was greater community trust, police might be more effective in crime prevention. Not because that, I think that based on Tracey's research, there's good reason to think that that's true. But the reason we wanted to set that point aside was that we didn't want to privilege one objective over the other, and so that people would have to deal with the trade-offs that necessarily the police must make in balancing their success at these different, each function, which is each very important in its own right.
If I can just dovetail off of that, and then to Jeremy's point, the question is about, I think, how metrics create perverse incentives. If you don't have a metric for the thing you care about most, in this case being community trust, then I think there's a real danger of that. Broken windows policing was designed to be, cost of life or quality of life responses to promote community policing. But if there was not a way to look at the ways that the community cared about being policing, if there was no metric for that, then it can become irresistible. So briefly, what I would say is, we're talking about procedural justice and we're talking about legitimacy. If there's no metric for that, then there's no safeguard against the possibility of it becoming a perverse incentive.
Let's move on then to Tracey Meares, who will be followed by Jose Lopez.
So I put myself on the queue a long time ago, and Sue actually asked the question that I wanted to ask, but I didn't want to ask it of Professor Sherman. I actually wanted to ask it of you, Sheriff O'Donnell, because, McDonnell, sorry. A lot of what you all have recommended is consonant with what we've heard throughout our several sessions, except for this idea of the minimum size of police agencies, which is why I think we find it intriguing. And, the advantages of it are obvious. I don't think we need to go into that. But my concern wasn't so much the localism point, but the pushback that we might get in recommending something like that among not just smaller agencies, but sheriff agencies in particular. And my sense is that they tend to be small, and they're also directly responsible to an electorate. And I was wondering if you, Sheriff, could speak to, if you agree with this idea or find it at least intriguing, what kinds of arguments you think your constituency would respond to in accepting that kind of a recommendation.
Oh, thank you. I do think it's very intriguing. I think it certainly bears further examination. And looking at that and looking at the 18,000 police agencies across America, certainly it's hard to have everybody in line with best practices when you have that many varieties and just sheer numbers of different leaders throughout the various organizations. I'd want to look at a much more detailed, I think, examination to be able to say it's a positive or negative, but there certainly are efficiencies that could be gained by regionalization. We see that on a lot of different fronts. The combining of different agencies, I know there would be pushback as far as the independence of local electeds, as far as having their own police department, and that's something that has probably perpetuated it being the way it is for so long. I think that it's hard to argue with the efficiency argument. But as far as the ability to be able to maintain a standard across the nation, but certainly the pushback, I think, would be significant from local jurisdictions who want to have that level of independence and to be able to have their own police agency that they believe will do a better job, providing police services than a larger agency might. So I think it's certainly worthy of further conversation. But I do think that there will be disparate perspectives on that.
Could I just clarify that I would be happy to exempt elected sheriffs from my proposal? Because they serve, the places where it would be an issue is where there's several hundred people in a county, and there's lots of counties in this country that have that small population. But where you have a police department, it's generally a city level or township or borough or something like that. And I think that's where the critical need is found.
Jose Lopez, followed by Chuck Ramsey, who will be the last questioner.
Yeah, so I have a question for Professor Sherman related to the decertification models. And so, right now there are two recommendations that you put forth. One is certifying and decertifying officers. Two is creating the database so that if an officer in fact does get decertified, that raises a flag so that other agencies across state and across the country are able to know that as a screening tool before hiring that officer. So it seems like in most states we have the potential to, or the board that can certify and or decertify officers. Just seems really hard to do that. So I'm just wondering, based on the states that we see that have this kind of decertification board or model, how often do we see officers in fact get decertified? And if not often, what can we do with this recommendation to give it some real teeth so that when officers are not doing their jobs and when they're violating people's civil rights, they're in fact held accountable for that?
Could I just clarify that my primary focus on certification of individuals is on chiefs of police, and not to certify them to be police officers, but to be executives of police agencies of at least 100 employees. And that would, I think, go a long way towards this nationally coherent idea that you get good surgery in every hospital, get good policing in every police department. With respect to the list of officers who are dismissed, it doesn't actually require that you have certification of the officers in the first place. That is, without having the states have to enact a statewide certification procedure for any local police department to hire somebody, which is actually a huge ask in cost and politics and everything else. I think to get something, we just start with the fact that if they've been hired as a police officer, and I think of Albuquerque, New Mexico, which was profiled in the New Yorker recently, when they had a push to hire lots of officers, they actually took people who had been fired in other agencies, if memory serves, and certainly they took people they had rejected in previous applications. But it just struck me in reading that article that this system, which is actually brand new in the UK, we have had the capacity to find this out, but there was a police officer who was sanctioned for having pushed somebody to the ground inappropriately who died of a heart attack in a demonstration, and he'd already been dismissed from another police force before he was hired in the one where he did that. And that sort of brought the issue up on the radar screen, so that just within the past 24 months, Britain has created this what's called struck-off register, which they've had for doctors for a long time. And so you can't practice medicine again once you've been struck off the register, and you can't practice policing once you've been struck off the register. But it is interesting that even in Britain, the decision to hire a police officer is completely local. There's no national board in certifying somebody who can become a police officer. It's the decision of the chief constable and the processes in each of the 43 independent police forces. So the tradition of local control as to who can be a police officer can be maintained even at the same time that you establish a struck-off register. And to do it at the federal level, again, the FBI, the DEA, any of these agencies could hire people however they do it now. But I believe it would be an innovation to have a federal register of everybody who's ever been dismissed, and that could be consulted not only by federal agencies, but also by the state and local. I think if we get that much out of it, although I did also recommend that the IPCCs, the Independent Police Complaints Commissions at a statewide level would have the power to recommend dismissal of a police officer and putting the officer on that register. That would be the kind of thing that you could toss out in a conference committee negotiation to get the bill up to the governor to sign it. And I take a very realpolitik view of all of these recommendations, that we simply can try to make some progress on all of these fronts with the hope that we'll get some benefit in terms of a higher standard of police attention to this goal of maintaining trust and confidence in the community with every person we hire and every incident that we investigate. Thank you.
Chuck Ramsey.
Very quickly, first of all, thank all of you very much. This has been very informative. You know, this task force has been charged with the goal of coming up with some recommendations for the president regarding policing. A lot of it has to do, obviously, with some of the recent events that occurred last year and the need for change, reform, or what have you. But just from your testimony, as well as panels that have appeared in prior listening sessions, it's very clear to me that policing is not the only area that needs to be reviewed and looked at. I think it's been 50-some-odd years since a comprehensive look at the entire criminal justice system has been done. I don't think asking once every 50 years or so to take another look is asking for too much. And I think that things have changed so dramatically that it's time. I'd like to hear your opinions about that, bringing together practitioners, researchers, academics, community, and whoever else can add value to the discussion, looking at, probation, parole, courts, corrections, reentry, poverty and education, which actually are made drivers of crime, different models that Dr. Sherman, you've mentioned. What's practical for the United States? Is there something better that we could be doing? I just would like your thoughts and opinions. And just as an aside, all the major police organizations, the Major City Chiefs Association, PERF, IACP, Noble, the Major County Sheriffs, National Sheriff's Association, have all come together making this request. And it, just from your perspective, one, do you agree with that? And two, what would you like to see as part of that, that look at criminal justice?
Well, you're looking
Any
at,
of you, yeah.
You're looking at me, so I'll go first. So absolutely, I think that there's no one who would disagree with the call for a coherent and comprehensive look at the criminal justice system that would include not just practitioners, but academics and community leaders and stakeholders. There needs to be that, an integrative approach, because as you know, Commissioner Ramsey and everyone in the room, it's frequently the case that law enforcement and the criminal justice system get packaged together in the minds of the citizenry. So what's happening in a grand jury room suddenly becomes the fault of the officer in the next day's encounter. And in fact, what happens in the legislature with regards to our immigration policy and our drug policy becomes the fault or the responsibility of the officer in the next encounter. What I would issue as a challenge to that is to say, and this goes back to your point, Chief Villaseñor, about what is traditional policing approaches, or even traditional criminal justice approaches, is that if we think that there are problems in terms of law enforcement's relationship with the community, they never start only there. I'll use the example of the thing that I work most closely with, which is issues of discrimination. If you imagine that there's discrimination within the context of criminal justice or law enforcement, then you have to also imagine that it happens in educational context, in housing context, in employment context, right, in healthcare context, and all of that is upstream of where someone would have contact with law enforcement. So you talked about drivers being poverty and educational outcomes, but those are not integrated systems in the way that we think about it. And when we talk about accountability and transparency for policing, we almost never mean accountability and transparency for state governance. And if what we're going to be doing is non-traditional approaches to change or to fix or to rectify certain problems within law enforcement, then I think we need to start way further upstream, and that we need to center policing and criminal justice outcomes in the national conversation about participating in American democracy. So if you're talking about a look at the criminal justice system, I think that's fair and appropriate and the appropriate scale. But I think that also then needs to be integrated with these upstream issues that are fundamental ways of participating in American democracy. Part of the issue of what has become traditional policing is traditional policing approaches have started with the acceptance that most of the American citizenry wants criminal justice to stay away and out of line of sight. And what that's done is it's separated it so that we picket police departments in a way that we would never picket our schools or our hospitals. So I would hope that if there's a call to do this, that there would be the opportunity first to do it on an ongoing way, that it doesn't just happen once, but that it happens once and then again and then again and then again, but also in an integrative way so that criminal justice is not on the hook for all of the criminal justice outcomes, and that communities are able to take sort of empowerment over the rest of it.
Thank you. Great great question to finish with. I'm fully supportive of a National Crime Commission. I think it's critical to the future of all of us being part of a greater nation. Crime is a symptom of dysfunction across the board. Police are the only entity that you can dial 3 numbers and get an immediate response and come out there into an emotionally charged, very difficult, complex situation, oftentimes with very, very little information to work with, and have to work very quickly and under sometimes life-threatening circumstances. It's dynamic, it's emotional, and it goes back to a number of root causes. Some of them mentioned here: healthcare, education, poverty as drivers, and so many others. But we tend to deal with it, and the focus is on the police as a silo. And we need to be able to have a response that's not a silo, but rather a web of all of the different entities that you mentioned earlier, and that starts with early childhood, healthcare, and then education, and then all the way through with mentoring and all of the things that we value and accept in many of our communities as the norm, but not in so many others. We need to be able also to have a coherent structure that rewards and incentivizes working together collaboratively, and that's something that we've pitted each other in many ways against each other, competing for very limited grants and budget dollars, and so we've tried to separate ourselves from others and in effect basically dissolved the team and instead acted as individual agencies where we couldn't possibly expect to be successful. So I think we do need to take a step back. We do need to treat what we do as a profession. The analogy earlier of the teaching hospital, I think, is critical. We don't do enough of those type of things. I think we can learn a lot from the healthcare model, looking at the underlying symptoms and then providing a treatment long-term for the individual, whether that's an individual person in the community or the body that we're tasked with protecting.
I think your suggestion is an excellent one. If you look at the evidence on citizen attitudes and confidence in the criminal justice system in general, policing comes off looking great by comparison. And I think stepping back and taking a larger view of, as you're suggesting, of the functioning of the criminal justice system is a very important and timely idea.
Just to put numbers on it, in both the United Kingdom and the United States, the confidence in local courts is running about 15% compared to 60s for the police, so there's a huge difference. And I think that the 1967 report of a commission appointed by President Johnson entitled The Challenge of Crime in a Free Society is something that shaped an entire generation of reform, not to say that careers of reformers, some of us being here at the table because of that report. But it's striking that that report was far more comprehensive and detailed with respect to the different pieces of the criminal justice system. So it wasn't just the overall report of the commission, it was the task force report on the police, the task force report on corrections, task force report, I believe, on probation, and even on science and technology. And there was so much research behind each one of those task force reports. So the first systematic observational evidence we have on police interaction with the public showing us that most of the time when they can make an arrest, they don't, was done by my PhD supervisor, the late Albert Reese at Yale, who observed 10,000 individuals with 36 observers encountering the police in about 3,000 situations in 3 cities. And that revolutionized our understanding of the police. It goes to a lack of investment in ongoing policy research that could help to contribute to reform. And I will contrast that commission with something that we've all forgotten about, which is one appointed by a later president. It's called the National Advisory Commission on Criminal Justice Standards and Goals, which I challenge anybody here to remember one recommendation of, because I don't think they did any research. I don't think the research was there to back up the recommendations. But I do think that if you go back to the '67 report, you will find a recommendation that we create much larger police departments all over the country.
Really? So let me also echo some of my panelists, fellow panelists' observations, and thank you for the question, Commissioner Ramsey. I'd frame it somewhat differently, however, and you said, is it time 50 years later to take a look at the criminal justice system? And actually, I would broaden our scope. I gave a talk a while ago referencing the same presidential commission that Professor Sherman alluded to, and the title of that talk was "The Tyranny of the Funnel." And the basic theory was that we have an intellectual tyranny, which is that we think of the system as our response to crime, right? And that we put everything into a funnel, and the police make an arrest, the prosecutors do what they do, judges adjudicate, it goes off the end of the assembly line, off to corrections or probation, and voila, we have justice. And that has, it's important to understand the operations of those agencies and to think about how each one of them can be improved. But actually the fundamental question I think we're talking about here, first of all, how do we prevent crime? That's not about the system only. But we also then quickly go to the recognition that we have to think carefully about how do we respond to the harm committed by one of us against another one of us, right? That's a democratic question, right? And what's the role of the state in that? But more importantly, what's the role of families and communities and to that harm? And if you start with the harm, we call it crime, but if you start with that harm, that means that somebody has been harmed. And that person may or may not have called the police. So, as some of you will know, I'm very influenced by the writing of my wife on this topic, on the victim's perspective on justice. And half of them never report to the police, and for most of them, even though they report to the police, they never see an arrest, so they never even get put into this assembly line that is the funnel. So I would start with, how do we respond to the harm that is committed by one of us against one of us? And that means doing something for the trauma experienced by that crime victim, as we call them. That's not compensation, that's not restitution necessarily, because that's the system at work. It's responding to the need of that one of us to have their life back on track. That's the first imperative of justice, in my view. And then we have the related question, which is how do we respond, if we can find that person, to the person who committed that harm against one of us in ways that recognize that they may have significant challenges that brought them to that moment, medical issues, mental health issues, and that there is some appropriate role of the state in exacting some sort of deprivation of liberty, perhaps, for very serious harm, but we have to limit that power as well. But we also should recognize that those two individuals may have something going on between them that the system is very poorly equipped to do anything about. They may have a history of conflict. They may be a landlord-tenant, who knows what. So the adjudication system that we all learn in law schools, very good law schools teach us this, actually take the blood out of those conflicts and disempower the individuals who are in conflict to do something about their relationship. So it's not the system that we need to start with. We need to start with these relationships and the harm caused by somebody against someone else, and ultimately for those who go into the system and become and convicted of very serious offenses. Another colleague of ours, Mark Moore, gave me this wonderful phrase once: we have to figure out how to live with the felons amongst us. Some of those people who caused harm are then adjudicated to have done something very serious, meaning they go off to prison, and guess what? They all come back. And they come back, and at some point they have no greater risk of reoffending than any one of us. That's what Blumstein tells us. So we have this question of how do we reintegrate, and here we can learn a lot from other countries. How do we reintegrate into our society those who have caused those harms, who have been adjudicated and have been taken away from us for a while? So it's not just the system, it's really these big democratic societal questions that go to, yes, they go to other government functions, but they really go to sort of how do we deal with conflict? How do we deal with conflict in our society? And it becomes more complicated when you add race to the equation, because we've overly racialized that system. And that system has done enormous harm to our pursuit of racial justice. So we've got a lot of work to do, but here's the final thought. The optimism that I sense, not just from my students, but from everybody who's in this field, that now is the time to really do things very differently, is palpable. And there's a sense that this is a breakthrough moment. So I think your idea, Commissioner, is really very timely.
On that very optimistic note, I think all of us should thank this marvelous panel. And I also want to say, I know all of you are extraordinarily busy. For you to move your schedules around on very short notice to be here, we're so appreciative. Let me then turn to my co-chair And we'll also turn to all of the panelists or task force members for their final comments.
Well, just a few final thoughts. This is the 7th and last listening session. It has been a very interesting experience, and we've gotten a lot of feedback, both from oral testimony, written testimony, people who appeared and asked questions from the audience. And I'm confident that we will have concrete recommendations for the President on March 2nd, as he has requested. I'm also very optimistic, like Jeremy Travis, that this is just the beginning of a much broader discussion that needs to happen if we really truly want change. And as we all know, the best opportunity for change is in a time when you have a crisis. And we're at that moment in history where we can move in one direction or another, but we know the status quo is not going to really get us anywhere. So I really welcome the challenge. I think this is an exciting time to be part of this profession. It's an exciting time, I would imagine, to be a researcher, to maybe have an opportunity to work in other countries and make comparisons and see how things can change by looking through a different lens that perhaps you didn't look through before you had that opportunity. But this is time now for us to not only listen, but to then turn this into some kind of action. And I think that was Chief Villaseñor that mentioned, how do you make that happen? How do we establish the lines of communication, the understanding of what's taking place? How do you make it happen in your particular jurisdiction? Just because it works in LA doesn't necessarily mean I can transplant it into Philadelphia, but I may have to tweak it a little bit. What should those tweaks be? I like what Dr. Goff said, that what we don't need is another commission that does work for 2 years, and then we have another 50 years where the report sits on a shelf. There has to be ongoing dialogue. We have to continually tweak and improve what we're doing, but also be sensitive in knowing that what we do in policing has a ripple effect on the rest of the system. And that's why we have to be very careful. Something as simple as not too long ago in Philadelphia, where a decision was made for some small minor offenses, summary offenses, that by state law we had been required to actually make a physical arrest. Now they want to issue citations. Fine, we issue citations, but who's going to process those things on the other end? Who's going to handle that workload? And so if something as simple as that has a ripple effect, unintended consequences that we have to carefully think through. And that's why I think a comprehensive look at everything, the drivers, what happens when somebody enters the funnel, what happens when they come out and back in. We talk about crime prevention, but what does that mean? At what point in time does that really start? How much crime will we accept before you actually do punish? And I mean, these are serious questions, and there needs to be some consistency in the way in which we apply it, so we don't have situations where people believe that if one group of people do this, another group of people do the same thing, that there'll be severe consequences for this group, but not so severe for another group. And whether that's real or perceived, it's something we have got to grapple with and we've got to deal with. And it's going to really require all of us, police and others, to take a real hard look at ourselves and even air a little bit of dirty laundry that initially may be a little uncomfortable, but in the long run will make for a stronger and better profession. So you all have helped us a great deal, more than you probably can imagine, and I want to thank all of you for that. And now I guess we'll turn to the other task force members for closing comments. We're going to start with Dr. Cedric Alexander, and we're going to work our way down.
Well, I think, Commissioner Ramsey, you pretty much stated it all, and without being redundant. And I want to thank you all for being here and sharing your experiences with us as well, too. And I, too, am very optimistic that what I really think we're embarking upon is going to be very important to this country now, because something needs to be done now and as we move towards the future as well. So thank you all very much.
So thanks to all the panelists who came in today. Very informative panel, some good recommendations that we will discuss. This wraps us up, I think. This is the last panel that we'll be having, and now we have a few days to deliberate and make some decisions and get this report to the White House early next week. My hope is that we can do that, that the recommendations are strong, that we can see them through even after this process, and also that we can do that in a timely way because time is crunched. But again, thank you to all of the panelists and all of the folks working behind the scenes. And I know we showed you a lot of love at the beginning, but definitely have to do that again because we have an amazing team of folks who have been assisting us in this process and guiding us along the way.
Amadou Diallo, Ramarley Graham, Tanisha Anderson, Akai Gurley, Kajim Powell, Antonio Martin, Sean Bell, Dontre Hamilton, Emmanuel Comfort, Michael Bell, Vonderrit Myers, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Ezel Ford, Ayanna Jones, and 200 days ago, Michael Brown. These are the names that brought thousands of young and old people from their homes over the last 200 days and beyond. These are the names that continue to shake me out of my comfort and hold me in a position of urgency. These are the names that brought me here, and I know many more names brought all of us here. I name the names because in all of our deliberations and reporting and testifying and wordsmithing and recommending, we must remember that this is fundamentally about the inherent, unnegotiable human dignity that all of our American systems should preserve and affirm and never threaten, especially for our most disenfranchised and marginalized people of color, low-income families, Black and brown children. Lives must not be lost for us to continue to have this conversation. Too often, the story of oppressed people is one of erasure, so I read these names in particular as we enter deliberations, not because they are the only names that matter, but because they are the ones to whom I am accountable. Their deaths require that we turn tragedy into permanent, systemic, racially equitable change. I believe that we have the power to do some good, but only if we keep our humanity at the center. I'm appreciative of the chance to take that step with all of you and deeply thankful to all of the people who've made this work possible. Thanks.
Thank you, Brittany. We began our hearings in January with a panel, and at that panel, one of our speakers, one of our witnesses was Professor Sam Walker. And in addition to invoking the 1967 report that we've spoken so much about today, he held up a book, which was the report of the Kerner Commission, which happened about the same time. The Kerner Commission's report was a response to some of the incidents like the ones that Brittany Packnett has just recounted, but it also turned out that many of the police riots, in fact, almost every single one of them, and if my memory of that report is correct, was sparked by some kind of police interaction, not necessarily a fatal incident, but some kind of police action. And so in addition to being mindful of the names that Brittany has just mentioned, I want us to be mindful of a particular history that we have recounted before. That is also our jumping off point. And while much progress has been made, as has been mentioned already today, that the policing that we have today is a function of in some part of the 1967 report, we have made much too little progress. And so it's my hope that we can connect what we're doing on this task force today to history, and that mindful of those lessons, we can make a collective decision that it's time to change.
Well, I especially want to thank the panel. This was probably the most incredible panel to end our series of hearings. I think criminal justice students around the nation, if they listened to just this particular panel, it would spur conversations for semesters and years to come. One of the things that I think brought us to this task force was what many of us have called the elephant in the room of race. And I think we've really discussed that quite a bit. But Professor Sherman, I appreciate you bringing the other elephant in the room to our attention, and that is, how do we improve this profession when we have 18,000 different ideas about how it should be done? And I think that is an issue that we have to grapple with, because at the end of the day, no matter how grand our recommendations are, we have to convince 18,000 leaders to adopt them. And so I really appreciate you escorting that elephant into the room. And thank you very much for all my fellow panel members and supporters. This has been an incredible discussion today. Thank you.
I would echo my colleagues' thanks for the witnesses here today and all of the witnesses that we've had over the course of the last several weeks. We've really engaged in an ongoing dialogue, and I think and hope that this is the start of that dialogue. And for the most part, the dialogue has not been about blame. It's about, recognition. As Professor Travis said earlier in his testimony, police are the tip of the spear. They bear a burden not of their own making in many, many respects. And I'm very encouraged and look forward to working together with the rest of the task force to come up with solid recommendations to give the President next week. But I think that really will just be the beginning, because we do have to recognize our history. And I think we also have to be ready to make history. And that's what I look forward to doing in the coming days. So thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity and the leadership that you've shown.
I'll tell you just a very quick story. About 6 months ago, I was actually invited to do a talk in Sweden, Stockholm, Sweden, and I took the flight over, and I was told by everybody that, to make my body adjust to the time zone, something I'm very sensitive right now, I should stay up all day and not go to sleep until nighttime in Sweden, which would be like a 40-hour day or something for me. So I did that, and I walked around Stockholm, Sweden. It was a beautiful sunny day. I was impressed because it was a much more diverse community than I thought it was going to be. And then I saw something that worried me. I saw a police officer having an encounter with a young mother who was surrounded by her 3 children that all looked under the age of 6. And I didn't speak any Swedish, and they were speaking in Swedish, so I couldn't understand what was going on, but it seemed like this mother was in crisis about something, and she was dealing with a police officer, so I watched what was going to happen, just given my own interest in these issues. And then I saw something quite amazing. The mother, at some point, just left, went into a store, and the police officer watched this mother's 3 children while she went into the store to get something. Then she came back out. She thanked the police officer thanked her. The kid said goodbye to the police officer. He said goodbye to the kids. And I realized she had asked him to watch her children while she went into the store. And my first reaction was that would never happen in America. Would never happen. What I'm most excited about and grateful about for this whole process is that I'm actually revising that opinion. I think we've heard testimony, we've heard from people who have perspectives that we can actually change the identity of policing, we can change the character of policing. So maybe that could happen in America. Maybe we can create communities where mothers with children who are in crisis feel like the police officer is the first person that they should talk to when they're trying to problem solve a situation. And I'm very excited about that. I was concerned whether we were going to get even more since we've heard so much, and absolutely that concern has been alleviated. You've all contributed something new, distinct, and different and valuable to the process that we're going to try to make forward. And I particularly want to appreciate this idea of reconciliation, because I think for many of us, the injury that has been created by centuries, decades of conflict, police being the manifestation of that conflict, cannot be addressed until we talk honestly about how we recover from that injury, no matter what the policy recommendations are. So I want to especially thank you for advancing that idea, and my colleagues for facilitating a process that has made me much more hopeful about what we can do about policing in this country.
Well, I think that I have experienced the World Series, the All-Star Game, and the Super Bowl at one with today's panel. My thanks to the co-chairs for bringing on this last panel. It couldn't have ended with any better representation of all the expertise and knowledge that we've been privileged enough to listen to. And I think it really brings up the point of the basis of research and the importance of research in any recommendations we come up with. We have to not give in to the attractive idea of basing recommendations upon anecdotal painting of issues. Truth has got to be the basis, and it has to be an all-encompassing truth supported by research at all levels. We need to be aware of the power, though, of perception and how perception can really influence the impact of our profession and the ability of us to do our job. And Brian's story here just, reminded me of something. I'm going to give another story from my agency that just off the cuff here to maybe help to reinforce his newfound feelings. On Valentine's Day, while I was at another one of these listening sessions, back home, they had a burglary of a flower truck that had thousands of bouquets and flower arrangements that were headed out to different, obviously, recipients. My officers located that truck, and when they opened it up, found that the air conditioning was off and the flowers were in danger of dying. We brought police cars in from around the sector. We filled the police cars with the flowers, took them back over to the floors to get them under air conditioning. And I think that's one day we probably could have measured our crime prevention efforts by all the bouquets that got delivered that day. But that's the type of people that I see when I talk about my police officers and the type of hearts that they have. And it's real easy to get caught up in the high-profile mistakes that we do make. Not saying we don't. But we also have to remember the reason most police officers went into this profession is to help others. We have to reclaim that idea and help make sure that they remember those thoughts and they recognize that and don't get affected by the cynicism that this job can do. So my thanks again to the staff, my sincere thanks to President Obama for putting this panel together and for allowing me to serve on this. And so back to the chairs.
Yeah, a few final thoughts. As a Washington native and a student of history, I think about the cynicism potentially about a task force set up to solve a problem. And I reflect back too on the Crime Commission, the Johnson Crime Commission, which I think has made a very substantial, had a substantial impact on our field. I teach about the Crime Commission findings to my students at George Mason. They're very interested in it and actually read it. And as some of you may know, my husband served as a young staff attorney writing about the police chapter, helping contribute to that. And I think it has had some fundamental influence on our field. But moving far ahead to today, one of the fundamental questions will be, whatever we write up, what happens to implementation? And I think several of you have mentioned that. And that, of course, is the big question. So moving ahead, I think your testimony today has been very, very helpful, as has that of other witnesses, in helping us in thinking ahead on what we do in our recommendations and what others do in helping us in grasping and grappling with those questions. And the issue about the 18,000 departments out there really goes to the fundamental heart of this. But thank you again for coming. Thank you for your thoughts. Thank you for all of your recommendations. And with that, let me turn back to our director, Ron Davis.
So once again, I say this every panel, but this is especially true as we close this phase up. On behalf of the president, let me thank the panelists for coming, for those that are watching, and especially for the task force members for their contribution. Now, interesting, when we talk about everybody mentioned about a 90-day task force, but if you look at the process that we're following and the steps that we're going into, there's really multiple phases that are going to extend beyond the 90 days. And so, for example, as we close this phase out, I'm struck by a couple of things. One, And I think Brian mentioned this, and I'm sitting here my own, after 28 years in law enforcement, my own changing in thoughts about certain things, that just the process of public hearings, listening to 150 witnesses, and just the quality of expertise and practitioners and community leaders that have really destroyed so many stereotypes just in the first phase of this process, that it says a lot. Views have changed on this panel. Views have probably changed in this nation just by watching and listening. So that's the first phase. We've shown how we can have diverse perspectives, ranging from community leaders and youth leaders to long-term police chiefs, and how we can come together, build consensus, agree to disagree without being violently disagreeable. We know all of this is just in the first part of it. Now we'll go into deliberations and provide a product to the president that everyone in this task force has worked hard to do, they'll be proud of. But then we know, as mentioned before, regardless of where we ultimately end up in this nation with regards to the amount of police departments, we still have an obligation right here, right now, to not only come up with this product, but to deliver it, sell it, improve it, implement it for the 18,000 agencies that are there. And so we're going to have to come up with a strategy for that, working together. So I have good news and bad news for the task force. The good news is we're getting very close to presenting the report to the president. The bad news, if you think this is the last time we're going to call on you, we still have to implement it to 18,000 departments. So your work is still much work ahead. But it's been one of my greatest professional privileges to work with this great team, to see these professionals, these great Americans come together in such a manner that it is something that I will look back 20 years from now and be proud of, and tell the kids and the grandkids what a good time this was to actually participate and to make the changes. But a lot of work ahead, but it's very exciting. And for this, I really want to thank the co-chairs. From a team point of view, I didn't tell them this. When he added this last panel, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, another facility and the work behind this. My team's going to kill me. What are we doing? And quite frankly, this was brilliance at its best. To be able to wrap it up, put a bow on it as we go into deliberations, as we close this public part for the community. As far as the hearing and listening session, I think there's no better way to start the next chapter. So thank you for your leadership. And with that, I think we're ready to close, Madam Chair and Mr. Chairman. We turn it back over to you.
I think with that, we again thank our panel and thank our listeners and thank our task force.
And let's give them all a round of applause. And we are officially adjourned. Thank you.